Welcome to the Knowledge Seeker channel. The channel is dedicated to exploring critical issues in the world. This presentation is titled Civilian Political Coups Instigate Military Intervention in Africa, Part 1. Thus, this is part 1 of a two-part series about political and military coups in Africa. In particular, part 1 focuses on the types of coups and the two major instigating factors for military coups. Please listen to both parts to get a comprehensive picture of coups in the continent. This map shows the 54 countries that make up Africa today. The purpose of this presentation is to achieve the following goals: explore the issue of coup d'etat or the sudden unconstitutional change of government in Africa. 2. Describe military and civilian types of coups. And 3. Identify the ways in which civilians, that is politicians, stage coups in the continent. To accomplish the goals of the presentation, the following arguments are made. 1. The artificiality of African countries generates conditions for African rulers to act unconstitutionally and undemocratically. 2. The unconstitutional and undemocratic tendencies of African rulers are responsible for provoking the military to stage coups. And 3. As far as African ruling elites continue to violate the constitutions of their countries by indulging in undemocratic practices, military coups will continue to take place in the continent. It could be said that there are two types of coups in Africa. A. Military coup d'etat, which is known all over the world. And then B. Civilian political coups. So what are they? A military coup takes place when the military forcefully evicts an existing political ruler from office and takes over the administration of the state through military rule. A military coup also takes place when a faction of the military overthrows an existing military regime. On the other hand, a civilian political coup takes place when an elected political leader directly or indirectly contravenes the constitution and the rule of law by remaining in power endlessly, when a political party insistently rigs elections to remain in power, when elected officials become authoritarian and use security forces to intimidate, detain, and incarcerate, and even kill citizens for expressing their democratic rights, when elected officials engage in massive pilfering of public funds, and when elected officials behave as internal colonialists by imposing themselves as monarchs and creating family dynasties, thereby subverting the people's will. Now, let's look at the two major causative factors for military coup. Scholars identify them as A. Push factors and B. Pull factors. Let's see what they mean. This is a military coup taking place, and you can see the soldiers are surrounded by a group of civilians who are joyful that the military has overthrown a civilian government. A. Push factors that instigate or prompt the military to stage coups. That means a tendency or propensity or a desire to intervene militarily. And there are many examples. 1. The personal ambition of some military officers. Indeed, some military coups have been staged to overthrow either civilian or military regimes due to the ambition of some military officers, Africa is dotted with cases in which military officers have staged coups in order to rule. It could be said that Uganda suffers from the ambition of some military officers. Likewise, the military regimes of Major General Muhammadu Buhari, General Ibrahim Babangida, and General Sani Abacha of Nigeria, the regime of Blaise Compaoré, who allegedly killed Captain Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, the coup of Colonel Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbazogo of Equatorial Guinea, who overthrew his uncle Francisco Macias Nguema in 1979, the coup of Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, the coup of Hissène Habré of Chad, and so on and so forth, were partially due to personal ambitions of the officers. Likewise, the killing of Patrice Lumumba by Colonel Mobutu Sese Seko in the Democratic Republic of the Congo was partially due to personal ambition as well as foreign influence. 2. Factional disaffection as a causative factor for military coups. The most common of this kind of military reason for intervention is during military rule. Thus, if a faction of the armed forces or some officers are not happy with the direction a military regime is going, a military coup could be staged to remove the leadership so that a new beginning could be initiated. This often happens when the ruling leadership embarks on unpopular national or institutional policies that threaten the image, prestige, and honor of the military institution or nation, thereby prompting a factional coup to remove the leadership. There are so many examples of this kind of reason in Africa. A. The Jerry Rawlings repeated coups that resulted in changing the corrupted military regimes in Ghana. B. The Ibrahim Babangida's military coup against Major General Buhari's regime in Nigeria. C. The Captain Valentine Strasser coup in 1992 in Sierra Leone. D. The President Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbazogo's coup in Equatorial Guinea against his uncle as stated earlier. E. The coup staged by the armed forces of Sudan to remove President Omar al-Bashir from power on April 11, 2019. F. The internal coup that resulted in the removal of President Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. And G. The counter coup which overthrew Lieutenant Colonel Paul Henry Sandaogo Damiba, and he was replaced by Captain Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso in September 2022. 3. Institutional justification for intervention based on the national interest. It seems that many military coups come under this category since national interest means many things. And there are many examples to cite from. A. Many civilians and military regimes have been overthrown for taking policies or actions that threaten national security and national interest. B. Captain Thomas Sankara's coup in Burkina Faso was designed to institute new thinking in the country. C. Jerry Rawlings' coups in Ghana were also influenced by national interest. D. President Yoweri Museveni's armed struggle in Uganda in 1980 over the disputed election in which the Uganda People's Congress won against the Uganda Patriotic Movement. F. The Egyptian military coup led by General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi on July 3, 2013, which removed President Mohamed Morsi from power, was regarded as being for the national interest. G. The coups that took place in Guinea, Mali, and Burkina Faso are also justified under national interest in the sense that they wanted to stop French neocolonialism. In the process, they evicted civilian political leaders who supported the status quo. Some Africans refer to these coups as a revolution to initiate a new beginning for Africa. And H, the coup of July 26, 2023 in Niger is justified on the grounds of national interest. 4. The contagion theory. The theory implies that if a military coup takes place in a particular country, it is likely to encourage military coups in neighboring countries in the same region. Coups based on contagion theory were very prevalent in the 1970s and 1980s in Africa and in Latin America. And there are many examples to cite from. A. In West Africa, Ghana and Nigeria demonstrated clearly the impact of the contagion theory in the 1970s and 1980s. Hence, whenever there was a military coup in Nigeria, sooner or later there would be a military coup in Ghana. Likewise, whenever there was a military coup in Ghana, sooner or later Nigeria too would experience a coup. B. The most recent effect of contagion took place in West and Central Africa. Thus, as soon as there was a military coup in Mali, it did not take long for a coup to take place in Guinea and Burkina Faso. Then Chad joined the bandwagon when President Idris Deby passed away and his son, General Muhammad Idris Deby, maneuvered himself to become the head of government instead of allowing the Speaker of the House to take over the position as stipulated by the Chadian constitution. C. Niger joined the bandwagon on July 26, 2023, while Sudan is now engaged in intra-military conflict after overthrowing the civilian administration. D. Then on August 6, 2023, Gabon experienced a military coup in which President Ali Bongo was overthrown by his cousin, General Brice Oligui Nguema. It is evident that the contagion theory is spreading military coups in such a way that some experts believe that other African countries might fall to the coup plague. The reason is that the political situation in most African countries is ripe for the possibility of coups if the political rulers do not provide conducive environments for frank political discussion and resolving of thorny issues that bedeck their countries. It is inferable that the Economic Community of West African States, that is, the ECOWAS leadership, is fearful that a coup could take place in other countries in the region if it does not take a strong stand against the military coup in Niger. Likewise, the same could be said of the Economic Community of Central African States. Hence, it wants the military in Gabon to restore President Ali Bongo as president, even though he has been overthrown by the military. 5. Foreign influence. Some military coups and insurrections in Africa are sponsored or influenced by foreign powers, especially the former colonial masters and those who seek to exploit critical minerals in the continent. It should be noted that when African countries send their military and police officers overseas for training, they are basically setting the stage for some of the officers to be recruited to serve the interests of foreign powers. Thus, some of the officers are manipulated to stage military coups. The coups that resulted in the killing of Patrice Lumumba, the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah, the killing of Sylvanus Olympio, Captain Thomas Sankara, and so on and so forth had foreign involvement. 6. The need to embezzle as a causative factor for military intervention. It could also be said that some military coups are staged by officers who want to embezzle public funds and become rich, like the political rulers who become excessively wealthy while being in power. 7. Poor economic outlook. When the economy goes down and the situation becomes unbearable for a large segment of the population, pressure develops to kick out the government in power. This contributes to the reason the masses dance sometimes when the military stages a coup to kick out an existing regime or administration, because they feel the economy is not working and something needs to be done. Now let's look at B, the pull factors that instigate the military to intervene. Basically, pull factors describe the factors that stimulate or provoke the military to act by intervening in politics. And there are many examples to cite from. 1. The association of the military with victories in war or sustaining the state. Quite often in Africa and many parts of the developing world, the military always seems to be the most developed and disciplined of the government institutions. Added to this is the perception often held by military personnel, especially the officers, that they are responsible for sustaining the state by carrying out their professional duties in a manner to boost national security. This perception tends to boost the image of the military institution and members of the armed forces. 2. A breakdown in cohesion or stability in society, resulting in lawlessness, rampant corruption, and a rise in crime. Quite often, due to the chaotic nature of politics, the members of the armed forces tend to view politicians as being responsible for the breakdown in law and order, corruption, crime, and a general deterioration in security, thereby justifying the need to take corrective measures through staging a coup. 3. Perception of threat to the military institution or of the officers or the nation. Some actions often taken by civilian authorities, such as cutting down the size of the armed forces, the unwarranted sudden discharge or removal of a certain number of well-trained high-ranking senior military officers in order to appoint junior officers to serve as the heads of the armed forces, and the police often irritate members of the armed forces. In Nigeria, new presidents often retire certain categories of high-ranking officers to enable officers of lower ranks to become the chiefs of the armed forces. This causes psychological trauma in the armed and police forces. Sometimes the civilian authority would place either his sons or relatives in critical military positions, thereby anchoring a large segment of the armed forces and the police. For instance, the son of President Museveni was the commander of a prestigious military unit before he was removed for threatening Kenya. Muhammad Idris Deby, the son of former President Idris Deby, was rapidly promoted to become a general in the Chadian army while he was in his 20s. People wondered how could such a young man become a general in the army. Some people imply that because his father was the head of state, and there are cases where African rulers have openly put their sons and daughters in critical positions. Here you have a data showing the trends in military coups in Africa. As you can see, in the 1950s, there were very few coups. Then in the 1960s, 1970s and 1980s, and even up to 1990s, the coups went up. However, in the 1970s and 1990s, many coups did not succeed. The same also goes in the early 2000s up to 2010. But now, between 2020 and 2023, the rate of successful coups are going up. Please take time and look at this data and you can see the trend in the continent. Now, let's look at the factors that influence civilians, that is politicians, to stage political coups in Africa. A. Push factors that compel civilians to stage coups, and there are many specific reasons. 1. Individual ambition. Just like as soldiers have ambition, so the civilians also have ambition. Generally, it is arguable that it is those civilians who are very ambitious that run for electoral offices. They want political power so that they can lead others in society. The desire for power and ruling over others seems to compel people to seek the presidency, governorship, senatorial, and representative positions of their countries, even though they have accomplished so much in life. Likewise, those who have not achieved much too are driven by ambition to get into power. The way civilians stage coups is quite different from the military orientation. Instead of an overt sudden change of regime or administration, civilians stage coups primarily by contravening the democratic system that they swear to uphold. It should be noted that democracy, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, is a very solemn political system because it allows the citizens to elect who should hold the mantle of leadership. Therefore, power lies with the people in a democracy and not with the ruling elite. So, in a democracy, the rulers are the servants of the people because they must carry out the mandate of the majority in duly constituted and conducted elections. When a ruler contravenes the trust bestowed upon him or her through democracy, he or she automatically stages a coup by ruling contrary to the will of the people. Thus, anytime the system is violated, the ruler forfeits his or her legitimacy, and from thenceforth, the person is ruling through the usurpation of the people's will. And that is a violation of democracy. It is a coup when a ruler ignores the constitution and the people by imposing himself or herself with total disregard for the people. Thus, ambition is like an opium that is so strong in compelling people to satisfy its the man. It is like a drug addiction. 2. Ego as a causative factor for military intervention. The feeling that one is superior and better than others in society to lead the nation or society is a push factor based on ego. Indeed, there are many politicians who have the psychological view that they are the most suitable to lead a country and guide it to a great success, and nobody else can do so except them. 3. Weak government institutions that causes politicians to stage coups. Some politicians tend to assume that since the institutions of government are weak, it is better for them and their political parties to remain in power for a long time so that the country can be strengthened and positioned for unimpeded political, economic, and infrastructural development. Those who think this way assume that a change in leadership and political party will negatively affect the growth of the nation. Hence, it is necessary for one individual and one political party to remain in power for a considerable length of time in order to consolidate the development and modernization of the state. And many politicians think this way. It is necessary to look at the pull factors that prompt civilian politicians to stage coups in Africa, and there are many examples of specific circumstances or situations. 1. The association of the ruler and his or political party with the success in gaining independence or transforming the country. Due to the success in attaining independence, the ruling elite assumes that the chief political figure who played the role of a father figure to the nation must be allowed to continue to rule. Moreover, since it was his political party that fought to gain independence from the colonial masters, he is entitled to serve like a king. A good example was the late President Robert Mugabe and the Patriotic Front, which created the impression that only they are patriotic enough to hold and sustain Zimbabwe. Likewise, the African National Congress in South Africa and its leadership also seem to assume that only they can hold the country together because they fought for the liberation of South Africa from the apartheid system. 2. A breakdown in society as a causative factor for political rulers to rule endlessly. This is an assumption that a breakdown in society is likely to take place if the same political leader and political party do not remain in power for a long duration to stabilize society and bring the multiple parts together. Thus, some political rulers tend to assume that only they can hold the country together. Hence, they must continue to remain in power, regardless of the circumstances. And this is very common in Africa. A good example of this behavior is found in Togo, where the Nasingbe family and members of his ethnic group and region strongly believe that they must be in power to sustain Togo, otherwise the country could destabilize. It also appears that Rwanda suffers from this orientation, as President Paul Kagame announced recently an intention to seek re-election after being in power for 20 or more years. He seems to think that Rwanda's stability might be threatened without him being in power. Thus, he is following the model adopted by President Museveni of Uganda. 3. A perception of threat to the ruler and the ruling political party. Almost all African countries that claim to be practicing democracy suffer from the feelings expressed by the rulers and their political parties that opposition candidates and political parties are a threat and hence must be prevented from winning any election. This also takes place when one region or ethnic group dominates the country and does not want other regions and or ethnic groups to take power. In such situations, the ruler makes sure all critical positions are held by members of the same ethnic group or region. The most notable of this kind of political environment was the rivalry between the Hutus and the Tutsis. Since independence, the Tutsis have tended to concentrate power among their members against the interests of the Hutus. The same could be found in Burundi. In Nigeria, the political parties in the early 1960s, namely the National Convention of Nigerian Citizens, the Northern People's Congress, and the Action Group, made sure they dominated their respective regions. This orientation fell apart when the military staged a coup and took over the country on January 15, 1966. However, President Buhari rehashed the methodology when he filled almost all critical national government positions with members of his ethnic group and religion as a civilian ruler of Nigeria from May 29, 2015 to May 29, 2023, thereby tribalizing the country. 4. Monarchical compulsion. In Africa, it seems that most politicians have not acclimatized themselves to the point of embracing democracy, even though they run for office under the banner of democracy. Instead, they are tempted to see the government as a monarchy by pretending to be traditional rulers who operate under the monarchical system. As a result, as soon as they get into power, they traditionalize political power and act as traditional kings and queens instead of serving as democrats. This contributes to the reason many African rulers remain in power endlessly. 5. Weak institutions as a causative factor for political coup. Since almost all African countries were former European colonies, the rulers adopted European institutions that are not effective in Africa. The ruling elites know that the institutions of government are weak and they capitalize on it to exploit the countries and the citizens. This explains their penchant to ignore the constitutions and laws of their countries and do as they wish. In short, they personalize the government and treat all government institutions as their personal instruments to enhance their political power with total disregard for the feelings of their citizens. Many African ruling elites feel as if the state belongs to them and all government employees work for them rather than for the state. As a result, they do as they wish by ensuring that the security chiefs serve their personal interests rather than that of the nation. Thus, the heads of the police, army, air force, navy, intelligence, and special forces work to protect the ruling elite against the citizens in almost every African country, except in few. They generally do not hesitate to use maximum force against the citizens to intimidate them and force them to accept the unconstitutional practices of the authoritarian rulers. 6. Authoritarian personality as a causative factor for political coups in Africa. As stated earlier, many civilian politicians are ambitious. The ambition seems to reinforce their need to dominate the state, hence becoming authoritarian, even though they claim to be democrats. Therefore, it is inferable that a vast majority of African countries that claim to be democracies are authoritarian. Hence, critics are treated harshly by the security forces. It is the authoritarian personality that drives the penchant for rule for life syndrome in the continent. This headline shows authoritarian governments in Africa. 7. Regionalism. Regionalism is a major political problem in many African countries. Some countries cannot move forward because some regions dominate the political, administrative, economic, and military sectors of the state, so much so that other regions are treated as colonies of the dominant regions. Quite often, in such countries, the ruling elites come mostly from the dominant regions, and they make sure that the elites from other regions have no opportunity to change the status quo. Thus, politics is basically played between the dominant and the dominated regions. The dominant regions insist on maintaining their predominance, while the dominated regions want to change the status quo by calling for a more democratic system that provides equal opportunity to all regions. The Tuaregs, Hutus, Oromos, the people of Casamance province in Senegal, the minority groups in Nigeria, the English-speaking sections of southern Cameroon, and so forth, feel dominated in their countries and want change. 8. Tribalism. Since current African countries were created by European powers, almost all of them are multi-ethnic. This means that they are made up of many ethnic and tribal groups. Thus, even before the so-called independence took place, the groups were already competing to dominate the colonies. Some ethnic and tribal groups eventually gained from the colonial powers and became dominant in influencing the affairs of the countries. As a result, even today, some ethnic and tribal groups continue to be the most dominant politically, economically, militarily, and administratively. The dominant groups tend to produce the political and military rulers of many African countries. Nigeria, Rwanda, Togo, Ivory Coast, Ethiopia, Niger, Congo, Chad, and Cameroon are typical examples. Therefore, in many countries, the politically dominant groups want to maintain their advantage by making sure that other ethnic and tribal groups do not override them. Nigeria suffers from this malady as the Islamic North insists on maintaining the status quo, while the Christian South calls for restructuring. This accounts for the reason some African rulers stage coups to remain in power endlessly to avoid other ethnic groups gaining an advantage. It could be said that the need to prevent individuals from certain ethnic groups and regions from taking power is one of the major reasons elections are rigged. The fear that the dominated groups will turn around on taking power to punish the dominant groups who had discriminated and marginalized them for decades is so frightening that many African rulers do not want to take any chance to allow the opposition to thrive. In conclusion to this part 1 of the presentation, which focuses on the push and pull factors for military intervention in Africa, the following observations are made. 1. In Africa, there are two types of coups, namely military coups and civilian political coups. 2. Generally, civilian political coups take place when the rulers usurp powers bestowed on them through the democratic system by contravening the constitution and the rule of law to impose themselves in an authoritarian manner and rule endlessly. 3. Military coups take place when the military reacts in response to the undemocratic, corrupt, and authoritarian practices of civilian rulers who behave as if they are monarchs instead of as democrats. 4. Scholars identify two major causative factors for the military to stage military coups. They are 1. Push factors and 2. Pull factors. 5. It is stated in this presentation that the same two major causative factors for military intervention can also be used to categorize the factors that compel civilian politicians to stage political coups in Africa. And 6. Since this is part 1 of a two-part presentation, please listen to part 2 in order to have a complete understanding of the factors that instigate military intervention in politics in Africa. Thank you for listening to this presentation. Please subscribe to the channel and listen to other very enlightening presentations in the channel. Again, thank you for listening to this presentation.